and welcome everyone out there. I'm Sarah Montaros, Senior Curator at DeCordova Sculpture Park and Museum. Tonight is an evening I've really long anticipated, a public culmination and consideration of Jeffrey's twofold projects here at DeCordova. While I share introductions, we will be screening some images of both of these outdoor and indoor exhibitions before I turn over the screen and the mics to Jeffrey and his conversant, Dr. Philip Deloria. We are recording this event, and you can enable live closed captions at the bottom of your screen. This past May, we opened our Sculpture Park season. We opened our Sculpture Park season with Jeffrey's reimagining of his monumental outdoor installation, Because Once You Enter My House, It Becomes Our House, which featured newly commissioned artworks and performances by artists Dana Claxton, Eric Paul Reach, and Luzine Hill. This was followed by Jeffrey's truly spectacular indoor show, Infinite Indigenous Queer Love, that opened here in October and will close in just a few weeks on March 13th, which debuted a series of new collages, an immersive display featuring massive hanging fringe sculptures, and recent videos created with collaborators, musicians, and performers. Together, these two consequential achievements reveal how Jeffrey's artistic radiance spreads like sunshine. It touches all surfaces and across so many media. His visual syntax is completely singular, while it also absorbs disparate references across music, Indigenous history and craft, abstraction, popular culture, and activism. So it's not an understatement to say that Jeffrey has shaped the contours of contemporary art as we know it, particularly through centering and complicating notions of Native American aesthetics, materiality, and worldviews. Born in Colorado, Jeffrey is Mississippi Choctaw Cherokee and now lives in Hudson, New York. Speaking with him this evening is an equally remarkable thinker and public voice for our times, Dr. Philip Deloria, an enrolled member of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. Professor of history at Harvard University, Deloria focuses on the social, cultural, and political histories of the relations among American Indian peoples and the United States. His numerous books include Playing Indian from 1998, Indians in Unexpected Places, 2004, and more recently, he published in 2019, Becoming Mary Sully Toward an American Indian Abstract, a fascinating recovery of the Dakota Sioux self-taught artist Mary Sully. His contributions are framed as within and distinct from American modernity and modernism. So I'm thrilled to have you both here in this virtual room and cannot think of keener minds to share in conversation. I know Philip has a lot of questions, probably too many questions for Jeffrey, so I won't delay any further except to give thanks to a few folks, Krista Alba, Haley Klauser, Sarah Beyer, Pat Collins, and Meg Lawton, and my heartfelt thanks to those in Jeffrey's studio, especially Bill Singer. Jeffrey and Philip will be in conversation until about 7:15, 7:20, after which we will hope to have time for Q&A from the audience. So if you would like to submit questions even while they're talking, you can do that through the Q&A function. And thank you all so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Sarah, for welcoming us, and and to all who are here as an audience. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Jeffrey, I wonder if we could start with the title of the show. These four words: infinite, indigenous, queer, love. So critical to defining the project. And what's really been striking to me, there's a gesture to this in the gallery in one of the signs, the labels, but the kind of interiority that we find around the inner words, literally the inner words of indigenous and queer, are two terms that we might associate with social identity, sites of assertion, right, of an identity, but also sites of ascription, right, identities that might be put upon other people, and therefore perhaps also sites of context or contest. And so, those words then are surrounded. I just love the sort of, these four words together, surrounded or enveloped, if you will, by the words infinite and love, which have a kind of transcendence, a kind of boundlessness to them, a sort of philosophical sort of sense. So I'm wondering if you might share with us a bit how you see the relationship among these words, one of interior and exterior, or philosophical and social, or sort of expansive on the one hand and contained on the other, kind of what's kind of behind these words that give us a sense of what's happening with the project?
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, I think we have had one conversation previous to this, and I was very appreciative that I feel like you're able to see things and articulate things that make me kind of look at the work a little bit differently. Um, and what I think about with what you just said was the notion of maybe how I think about community. That within community there is an interior and an exterior. There is a self-assertion, and there's also kind of how outsiders view that community. And so I think with any identity, in particular like Indigenous and queer, sometimes those communities feel like it's by invite only, and one of the ways of gaining your invitation is by asserting your own identity. A little more complicated, I think, with Indigenous for lots of reasons. But I think that those are two kind of, I'm going to refer to them as like tags that have been both assigned to me and I've had to negotiate with and during my whole entire lifetime. I think, I mean, maybe queer when I was younger was gay, and then I think the idea of queerness being something that's so much more open and kind of stepping away from a more didactic way of describing things. So yeah, during my whole career, oftentimes people have, when it comes to identity, kind of questioned me about, am I pigeonholing myself by identifying as an Indigenous artist or as a queer artist? And to me, that is a question and a concern that comes out of, fear of the kind of tropes of identity, rather than focusing on the kind of richness that's possible when we all self-identify and maybe even negotiate the identities that are put upon us. And so probably through that negotiation in my own lifetime, I would say that I have fallen in love with those communities and, the kind of ephemeral and I don't know, I keep using this word atmospheric qualities of history and of community is maybe where the notion of time comes in. When I think about, in particular, tradition, and that's something also that's been placed upon me since the beginning of identifying as a Native artist, is does my work relate to tradition? Does it need to relate to tradition? Am I causing any disruption by kind of, creating my own aesthetic? And so that time notion, I think, is really important. And to be quite honest, like I said before, when I was younger, maybe queer would have been gay. Queer is a marker of time, that things have, in my opinion, progressed to some place that's more open. And I think the goal in my art making over the last 20 years has been very similar in trying to find ways of making more space, like extending the spectrums of how we think about all of these things, giving them forms that kind of subvert and surprise and extend, while also acknowledging really truthfully where they're from. And so yeah, I don't think I was that conscious when I decided to put those four words together. They felt actually pretty radical. And I remember when I approached Sarah about this as the title, to which she was totally, fully supportive, I felt sort of not sheepish, but sort of like, is this just too nuts, to put these four words together? But then that's kind of the way things come into normalcy, right? Is they just kind of get put into the world and they get practiced and they get given an image and a form and they get distributed and circulated and they start to feel like more like, oh yeah, that is a thing. These four words really become a thing. And the exhibition itself was about giving it an image and a form.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting, right? The dynamic that you have going here, right? On the one hand, sort of, norms and the normative and bringing things into something to be as recognizable, the sort of notion of tradition, right? A kind of established set of patterns that, kind of might be considered normative. And yet, as you're talking about, right, the sort of shift that we've seen, right, over, our lifetimes from sort of gay as reflecting a kind of practice, a sexuality, to queer as a kind of much, as you said, right, I think correctly, a much more expansive kind of thing, which is all about, kind of questioning those things which are received norms in that, in that sense. And it feels to me exactly that this question of temporality, is really one of the things that's quite at stake here. There's a forward motion that feels to me, right, in that sort of move. The other thing, I mean, this shows up for those who've seen the show or going to see the show, right? There's a Infinite Indigenous Queer Love 2021. One of the particular images has it's quoting you actually in the the wall panel, the label, and you talk about this sort of shift from gay to queer, but also the shift from Native to Indigenous. And that also seems to have at least a forward motion, perhaps temporality, but also spatially, right? I mean, that indigeneity takes on certain kinds of global, kinds of qualities. I'm wondering if you've got thoughts about that shift as well, about where indigeneity is, as opposed to sort of Native or Indian or some of those other kinds of ways of framing things.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think, and there's so many kind of similarities, I think, within African American and Black American terminology, that sort of would change, right, with each kind of movement or almost like moments of protest, and things historically. And so to go back to, Indian, to go back to American Indian, Native American, and I think, part of it comes from this kind of recognition that these are independent cultures, right? They exist without America. And so that to me is, it's not even so much about it being a political statement as much as an acknowledgement that it's like, oh yeah, these did exist pre-America, United States. And so that kind of begins to give reason why shift, why move forward. And I think also the kind of joining of communities and collectives across the world globally to bring in, Pacific Islander, to bring in, who are the indigenous people of all lands. So whether we're talking about the Sami people, or we're talking about the Maori, or we're talking about the indigenous people in Australia, all of this, I think that's what Indigenous begins to acknowledge, is that there's a global indigeneity, and the questions are new, right? In that sort of like, okay, so if we're going to break this apart into different kinds of indigeneity, first we have to acknowledge that this is not a local thing, right? And this is something that has a tremendous history across the globe. And maybe the next step is to acknowledge that there is a Choctaw community, and there is a Cherokee community, and there is 700 different nations in this North America. And so that to me is also about time, right? Because it indicates the questions that are present, and then the pursuit of the answers of those questions is what indicates the future.
I've been casting around for these sorts of words, and the word I've really liked of late is the word autochthonous, and I like it because it's got a CH kind of thing, and it's a geological term that sort of reflects like a geological formation that is in place and has been in place and doesn't move, hasn't changed, right? And I think sort of sense that like, yeah, Native nations have been Native nations since before there were European colonizations, right? That there's an Old Testament, there's a classical history of this continent, right? If we were to analogize it to Europe and the Mediterranean, that absolutely matters here. And it makes me think, that your collages are really rich with emblems of the past, of pastness and gestures to tradition, whether it's beads, whether it's kind of badges and buttons of the Red Power movement, these kinds of things. And I'm wondering if you might reflect with us a bit about sort of how you see history, playing out as a subject, of the work. And I think about this coming to it from thinking quite a bit about Native music and even forms like Native hip hop and Native metal, music, where the average American musician is not actually writing songs about history, or about the past. But Native musicians, and I think Native artists and Native cultural producers, right, are constantly engaged with these kinds of questions about the past. And I'm wondering sort of how you see that particular sense of temporality playing out in the work.
I mean, for me, I suppose maybe that's where I'm kind of in a privileged artist space where I think I can allow myself to be kind of in awe of the past and kind of be unsatisfied with the way the past has been presented to me. You know, you realize it's so much more rich than it's presented, and it offers so much, and there's so many things still yet to be unpacked. I think for a lot of Indigenous and Native people, I think that there's and I'll just speak for myself, but there's a desire to honor the kind of literal DNA of what has kept us alive, you know. And for me, the innovation, whether, you know, because I always have to remind people that beadwork in itself is its own modern movement. You know, pre-beadwork is going to be earth paints, it's going to be moose hair, it's going to be horse hair, it's going to be clay and stone beads or shell or bone. So, you know, this sort of my choice to work with glass beads that is popularly recognized as traditional is really relatively recent historically. And so here's an example where it's like, in my mind, again, my kind of privileged artist mind, I think, what if I did a whole series with only like local earth paints? Like, what does this land that I'm on look like in paint, you know? And even that kind of global trade of, if I wanted to get pigments from the Mediterranean, you know, that was happening hundreds of years ago. And I would still have to do that now, right? So we're still kind of reflecting a kind of globalism of how materials move around the country and kind of influence each other. So yeah, I think for me, and then, you know, sometimes the question comes in my mind about like, well, how do I make it, it's not even how do I make it contemporary, it's more sort of like, I mean, they're one and the same, I suppose, but like, how do I make it reflect the world that I live in, you know? And I think, oftentimes I talk about the density of these works in particular, which one of the goals was literally to make them like, how dense can I make a work on paper? And so the patterns have to go edge to edge, the color has to kind of make each other vibrate, you know? And to be quite honest, the beadwork and things has to get lost into the flat color of the paint. So the density isn't just top to bottom, left to right, but it's also spatially like front into some sort of illusory depth. And I think that's kind of how I would describe modern contemporary world, you know, for better or for worse. But I hope that density that's in the works, all of it is literally a sampling of intentional kind of thought about these histories.
I mean, I think with the images that we've just been looking at, you know, I mean, there's so many layers there, right? There's so much density. It's almost kind of geological, right? What you've done on the canvas in terms of, or the paper, in terms of layering and layering, and the beadwork then, you know, coming in. I'm assuming near the end, you know, in terms of the process. I mean, one of the things that's so interesting about these works is, you know, one is really challenged to sort of think like, what happened and then what happened. I mean, it invites the viewer to sort of imagine the process, right? The processual kinds of, you know, elements of the work. I mean, certainly, I mean, when I look at these, I see things which are sort of quintessentially kind of modernist practices, you know, collage, abstraction, these kinds of things. But I also see a lot of sort of references and gestures to things which fit into, I'm not sure we want to say the word traditional, right, in this sort of sense. I mean, we've just taken this,
fine. Yeah.
You know, in terms of beadwork as a modern, you know, kind of historical kind of phenomenon. But certainly, you know, for me, thinking about Northern Plains and thinking about beadwork and the ways that beadwork sort of steps in a little bit for the older arts of quill work, and that where quill work doesn't love the triangle and the diamond in the ways that beadwork loves the triangle and the diamond, you know. And I'm wondering, and also the sort of like the figure ground kind of elements, which I think are so prevalent, you know, in a lot of Native arts, you know, kind of, you know, I see it a lot in the plains, but I think it's a continental, you know, kind of figure. And both of those things for me, like, jump out of those images, you know, there. And I'm wondering sort of how you think about that, because I mean, the figure of the triangle is sort of everywhere. That you do, particularly your conversion of words into like nearly, challengingly, almost indecipherable, kinds of geometric sorts of forms. And so I'm wondering if, how you're thinking about those kinds of things. I don't mean to like take us to affect my own fascination with the triangle, but
no, that's okay. I mean, I think the triangle is just the most incredibly variable shape. It really, because there's, first of all, there's many different kinds of triangles, right? So even though I work with a triangle, if I elongate it in one direction, or if I create some huge obtuse angle like in another one, it radically shifts with scale the composition of the entirety of the piece. I think I also like that the rectangle still, and the rectangle that I use oftentimes, which does include a right angle, that oftentimes to me continues to indicate a rectangle, because you still end up with this kind of bisecting of the rectangle on the diagonal. So we have the triangle, but somehow our eyes still, or my eye still sees the other triangle. In my case, usually, and in these paintings, in the case of these paintings, an open negative space that shows what's underneath, right? So to me, the triangle is sort of my endless, it continues to give and give and give. So that's part of it. And then I think the figure ground stuff I do think about a lot. I think, and I'm just going to make a really broad assumption here, but I think my experience with Western European aesthetics is things like pattern oftentimes become the background for the figure. And I think for a lot of indigenous cultures, pattern can serve as the subject itself and does not require the figure. So when I put a figure or an image in there, that figure ground, I want to almost reverse them, or at least make them hold equal ground. And there's something about, if I put in some of those pieces, a face, which has an eye, which might be a similar scale of a triangle, just compositionally, they begin to start holding similar space, or it's difficult to pull one out from the other. It's almost like they're integrated and need each other.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. I mean, in terms of sort of how some of these images seem to, at least seem to me to work to my, to my own eye. And I also, I think of triangles and beadworks. I think of like one bead, two beads,
right,
four beads, right? That particular frame. But your sense of this, of like the triangle as a kind of bisected rectangle with the negative space sort of implied there. I mean, that actually, I think is quite telling. As I look back upon the triangles that oftentimes are showing up in your work, that's exactly how they are, right? They're those forms of triangles. I wonder if we could, so beads are absolutely fascinating, I think, right, as objects of history, as sort of vectors of colonialism and exchange, but also, as you've sort of said, innovation that kind of both lays claim to the idea of the traditional, but also is a fundamentally modern, kind of thing. I wonder if we might talk a bit about fringe as, another kind of one of these forms. I mean, and if those who've seen the show, when you move into the sort of second large gallery, what you'll see, right, is that Jeffrey's taken fringe sort of far beyond its familiar reaches, while making clear that we're still looking at fringe. And for me, what was so striking about being in the presence of these, kind of stunning, kind of monolithic, almost Stonehenge-like, kinds of figures was the dynamic that I experienced between kind of their seeming stasis, right? I mean, they seem very still, but the motion of a human being in the gallery actually puts them in very, very subtle motion themselves, right? So there's a dynamic there between sort of stasis and movement, between sort of, the sort of monolithic, timeless kind of quality to them, and a kind of temporality that one can see. And, of course, Sarah was not too keen on me doing this, right? But I felt like I had to get up close to them and sort of wave my hand in front and, actually put them in a more sort of substantive motion. And I suspect that's actually probably not the way to see them. The way to see them or experience them not that there's perhaps a right or wrong, but is to imagine the very, very, very subtle sort of movement there. And so I guess I'm wondering if maybe you'd chat with us a bit more about sort of how fringe is sort of working here, how this is, how these are adaptations of, you know, a more familiar fringe that we might imagine as a clothing adornment or you know, or things like that.
Well, I mean, a couple of thoughts. One, I think the way that you described the fringe cubes is almost like a very similar to the way I was trying to describe my fascination with history. Right? It's presented it to us as something that is static, and kind of locked in time. And then as you get closer, you realize you're like, oh, it moves, and if I look at it from another shape, I see a different color. And if I look at it from another perspective, there's a different sheen, or I see a different shadow, so I think that's when I first started conceiving of these, it really was very much about that monolithic, Stonehenge kind of shape, sculpture in particular, that sculptural shape that is meant to represent sort of like, I would say time, but almost as a kind of stability of time, and in fact, I don't believe that it is stable. I think it's always in movement. And fringe is, in the studio, we always use fringe, even if it's on a garment. The fringe on the sleeves is 11 feet long, and it makes it difficult to move in. You could never dance in that the way you could dance in a fancy dance shawl. And that kind of, I think as an artist thinking about pushing materials, whether it's paint or beads or fringe, there's something when it's on a garment, everybody likes to touch the fringe and feel the weight of the fringe. And I will always tell them, I was like, imagine lifting your arm. Your arm's going to weigh 12 pounds, so it exhausts you faster. But there's both an intention, and then there's also an absurdity that happens with that. So I just wanted to kind of move that. It occurred to me, I was like, oh, gravity, fringe, I can cut it any length. I could make these 12 foot tall. I think they're actually at the end about 11 and a half feet tall fringe cubes. And I've seen the blunt cut on garments and punching bags. I knew we could get this hard edge at the bottom and this kind of floating quality with the fringe, like they could appear to be these solid forms. And the other thing is, fringe is oftentimes like a support role material. It's rarely ever the subject. And I thought, here's another opportunity to take something that's usually on the periphery, in the way that we're used to seeing it, and making it like a really substantial figure, what we're used to seeing as the figure. And and that was really, and I've told the story before about 2001: A Space Odyssey, which I had never watched, but really is where I decided to watch it. I think it was last summer. And, there's that monolithic sculpture there, which represents kind of future modernity. And, but in my mind, also kind of like the removal of a kind of humanity, and a more kind of like visceral, bodily kind of humanity. And so I wanted to make something that countered that and queered it, to be quite honest, like, to take something that it's not celebrating the sort of stoic, historically masculine kind of perspective, but it's something that moves. It's something that is beautiful. It's something that is collective. This is made up of thousands. It's not made up of one. It's thousands that become one. And so, yeah, it almost, bizarrely, it feels very literal to me.
Yeah, I think it's worth, noting that these cubes are really dense, right? I mean, it's not a full cube worth of, but it's remind me, is it a foot worth or 18 inches?
I think it's about 9 inches worth on every side. Yeah, we had made it for 18 inches, and then as they were coming together, we realized, for time reasons, 18 inches would have taken twice as long.
Yeah.
And 9 inches was totally sufficient. We could have even stopped a little sooner.
I mean, I also, sort of read these as, a really self-conscious sort of exercise in taking up space, right? In this case, the space of the gallery. And this feels to me like a really important kind of part of an indigenous aesthetic, right? Of saying like, look, if we're in a continental space that has been constrained and constrained and constrained for us, when we find opportunities, we're going to actually take up space. I mean, I even see that in terms of thinking about like early native folks playing early versions of football, right? Which is totally about space, owning and occupying space relative to, sort of a colonial kind of, project. Jeffrey, in our earlier conversation, you spent some time thinking with me about the nature of found objects, in this work, and you mentioned that you have a large collection of sort of found objects that find their way into these works. And I felt like one of the most intriguing things that you said during that earlier conversation was that abstract expressionism, we were talking about sort of modernism, and maybe we find a chance to come back around to that, but you said abstract expressionism is functioning as a found object, right, in these works. Indigeneity is not functioning as a found object. And I wonder if you might, reflect a little bit more on that, and the ways in which these works find themselves situated in relation to some of the things that we would associate with modernism, that we mentioned earlier, collage and abstraction and minimalism and things like that.
I mean, what I mean by, abstract expressionism as a found object is kind of like that history is so, correct or not correct, exists in our kind of cultural psyche as founded. You know what I mean? It's been written about, it's been photographed, it's been canonized, it's been collected, it's been valued. So it has its own kind of objectness in our culture, which, sure, you could go deeper. We could kind of start diving into different kind of sub-histories within it, and I'm sure find more. But there's so many things that are questionable about that kind of packaged modern abstract expressionism, so the ones that many of us are probably familiar with, of course, is like many of those artists were looking at non-Western artists and kind of riffing off what they were finding there. For me, I think the kind of gestural release, the kind of emotive release that is celebrated within abstract expressionism, I think there's plenty of evidence to say was denied to Indigenous and Native artists, historically, right? And so that denial is one that is all about acculturation. It's all about colonizing. It's all about removing voice. It's all about endurance of just survival, right, under circumstances that are inequitable. And so, I think for someone who has experienced that or who is aware of that, to sort of give themselves the release, or to give themselves the kind of idea that it's like it's okay to do too much, to like spill outside of the box, and to kind of like not feel so contained all the time, I think is my reaction to abstract expressionism. And having been a teacher for 20 years, seeing lots of students, I'm going to say in particular students of color, struggle with self-expression, and to talk to them and say like, well, how does your family feel about you choosing to be an artist? And then they're afraid to tell their family. Again, it's sort of stepping into that, not choosing the sure thing that's going to kind of like potentially ensure some kind of stability in life.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's sort of what I mean by found object, and there is a Native American found object, to be honest, which is a kind of cliched, stoic, narrow, and that's completely, again, what I'm reacting against in trying to just kind of make it implode and let that kind of implosion exist on the surface of a painting or a piece of paper.
Yeah, sort of the thing that Gerald Bisner would make a distinction, right, between the sort of like the Indian figure, which is, kind of descended into kitsch, and the what does he say? Postmodern. It's not postmodern. The warriors of survivance, right? The sort of post-Indian warriors of survivance, right? Who sort of are kind of moving into different, different kinds of spaces.
Well, here's a great example here. So this, in the piece on the right, Infinite Indigenous Queer Love, in the framed kind of section on the right, in the lower right-hand corner of there, you see Hiawatha. It's an image from 1917 of Hiawatha, and that is an image which just emerged out of enthusiasm for a character which was originally a male warrior named Hiawatha, but when it became operatic right? In the Western American mind, she became a maiden, right? And so but that maiden never existed. She never existed. And my attraction to this image was initially because this was also a time period when clearly they were not using indigenous women as models for these. They were using women of Western beauty standards, right? That kind of portrayed Western beauty standards. And just so what made them Indian or made them native was putting a headdress on them. It's like, and so I've certainly grown up with seeing lots of protest against these kinds of images, but I have to say the protests that I've seen pointed out that it was wrong. But I've always desired sort of like, okay, well then what's another true version? And for me, that true version are the two women who are pictured here, who on the right is Roxy Romero, and on the left, you can kind of see her coming through this red glaze, is Regan DeLoggins. And these are two activist women who are, core members of the Indigenous Kinship Collective in New York City. And so that was sort of how that kind of collection of images came together.
Yeah. Regan DeLoggins. I think I've had a nice phone conversation with her at one point.
Yeah.
We were talking about costumes and clothing and gestures around that. I wonder. I mean, how does this fit within the sort of the kind of, I don't know, the sort of quasi-canon of Indigenous modernism? I mean, I think about, you were talking about abstract expressionism. I think about like what Jackson Pollock could get away with, that like
Right.
Oscar Howe, who has a show opening up at NMAI New York in very short order, by the way, could never get away with. And in fact, he was a very constrained, person in many ways, sort of like presenting in a fairly conservative way, except for at a couple of, particular kinds of moments. But it does, it does make me wonder about sort of how we think about, and of course, this is part of what my last book was about, was trying to like take apart the sort of notion that Indigenous modernism and abstraction, emerges in the, kind of late 40s, 50s, 60s, takes root in the Institute of American Indian Arts, and sort of, culminates with, I don't know, Fritz Scholder, T.C. Cannon, folks like that. I mean, is it useful for us to kind of pull out that category of sort of?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I think I look at those artists as mentors or role models of some sort. Just just being aware of their own narratives. I do think somebody like Jackson Pollock, the kind of culturally interested non-native community of that time could relate to Jackson Pollock. Do you know what I mean? They could relate to the presentation, the kind of charged narratives that was being presented alongside his work. And so in a weird way, he becomes this like hero, this kind of anti-establishment hero that, and then those paintings can become establishment, right? They can become symbols of establishment. And I'm going to go back to where we started with this idea of like interior and exterior of communities. I think with Native people, I think when those works were made, the Native modernists, you still, if you were non-native, are left as a viewer. You're still left as an outsider. You're not able to kind of like understand on a kind of peer level the interior of those paintings. Do you know what I mean? The imagery is still, if we're just looking at Oscar Howe, the imagery is still of a ceremony that you've never experienced, right? It's still a forbidden space for you to go into. And so I think it's just left to be looked at. And if that's where that relationship remains, being an artist, even if we continue to talk about Jackson Pollock, the support, the money, the exposure, the collecting that happens with an artist actually, not entirely, but does allow them to grow, And without that, it's very easy to continue being an artist working in your own studio, and many people never learning about you, which is why Oscar Howe is just now in 2022 having his first survey exhibition. Yeah. And T.C. Cannon was just collected by MoMA,
Right. And just, kind of only a few years ago had it,
right. For a painting that I believe was painted in 1968,
I wonder if, we might sort of reflect, and we don't have a ton of time, but a little bit of time. I wonder if you might reflect a bit more about some of the kind of cross-media, cross-material nature that we can, see in these works, where, there's an image of a photo of a person performing in garments and masks, right? All of which you produced in one form or another. I mean, I'm wondering sort of like what kind of philosophy goes into that kind of assemblage, what kind of effects it produces. I mean, I read it and I look at it and I find myself asking, well, okay, is this linear? That is it a process that's sort of moving from item to item? Is it sort of simultaneous? Is it relational? Sort of how do we think about that? And it is probably a good time for us to sort of think a bit more about how moving images are part of this exhibit and part of the work as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a couple of things. One, I think people began talking to me about these different levels of being an artist. So you're emerging in the beginning, and then you're established, and then you I don't know what's the next one, mature, mid-career, like all of these levels. And I think I realized that, I've been doing this for a while, and I feel like I've done a lot of work trying to introduce ideas to audiences. And I thought, I think the foundation is broad enough now for me to start taking more risks in the work. And I think that these particular pieces on paper at De Cordova really mark me doing that, in terms of just like my natural aesthetic is very much reflected in those pieces. My intuitive aesthetic is very much reflected in those pieces. And I've always had a kind of vision that includes everything at once. And for many people, they've always said like, oh, that's too much information. It's like overload. I don't know how to read it. I don't know how to like follow this. And so I've kind of held back. Same thing with color. Oftentimes we're seeing my real use of color in those works on paper as well, And so I think I also started thinking about kind of an artist biography, and not, it's not grim in any way, but I am thinking about like, oh yeah, I've had catalogs at this point. People write about the work. I want to put clues in the work about who and what I engaged with in my life. And so the collaborators really serve that purpose. They are, again, they're the unfolding. They're kind of threads. When someone writes my biography and things get unraveled, they're going to have to ask, who is MX Oops, this person who we're seeing here? And MX Oops is somebody who shows up in one of the works on paper. MX Oops is somebody who has collaborated with me numerous times, is somebody who is this particular video that we're looking at here, To Feel Myself Beloved on the Earth, was shot during COVID. The soundtrack at this particular moment in the video is chanting and protest at a Black Trans Lives Matter rally in New York City in 2020. 2020? Yes, 2020. So again, it marks what was happening at that time, So I always think about the future exhibition, let's say in 2041, when they say like, oh, let's look at what was happening 20 years ago. Here's an example of what was happening 20 years ago, was something that was significant, was somebody who was kind of in their body, in their look, in their dance, in their community, was expanding these ideas of identity in the way that they were progressive at that moment, So that's how I see all the collaborators. It's how I see Regan, it's how I see Roxy, Eric Paul, Luzine Hill, Dana Claxton. They're all kind of extensions. And I will just be the nexus point of these things that cross over.
Yeah, well, it's quite a it's quite an assembly, quite a group of of collaborators. I know
Emily Johnson, yeah,
a bit, and she's a deeply impressive artist, in her own right.
For sure.
You've got a crew, right? I mean, you've got a wonderful collection of folks. So Sarah had said, well, maybe we chat until about 7:15, maybe 7:20. Maybe I could ask one more question as a way of sort of like leading us into the audience. And I see that at least one person has put something in the Q&A, and I think we can invite the audience to, to start maybe thinking about some questions that you'd like to pose. So, in our previous conversation, you mentioned what I thought was quite an interesting and productive dynamic. You said something like this, that it was, and you mentioned this word earlier, right? And the word was fear. You said something like it was important to engage fear. And I wrote this down exactly as a way of getting outside the comfort of never being surprised. And that, fear, we were talking about, your sort of sense about what the fringe cubes would look like, and how they would function. That fear was kind of, I sort of read what you were saying was it's a species of attentiveness, right? A way of staying on your toes, paying attention, keeping yourself on the ball, in a kind of relational world. And this is kind of my experience of the art, and I suspect it is not mine alone. But I'm wondering sort of about this sort of notion about the artist's attention, right, which generates an attention in the viewer or the person who's experiencing things, and how that feedback loop kind of works, for you as you're making art.
Well, I mean, in this case, specifically, we were really struggling to meet the deadline, And so I think, luckily, there was someone who I knew, Maria Maltini, who is a Boston artist, a wonderful artist, who is a crafter, And when I knew we needed to find hands, we needed to find kind of really skilled hands. And so we called her up, and I had no idea, but she had been running this kind of, I think they're called something, the elves or something. Maybe Sarah might know this better than me, but yeah, they showed up, these amazing team of crafters who were just like, oh yeah, we understand this, we comprehend the whole thing about accumulation and things like that. But there was the stress in the studio, and the fringe started showing up. When we contacted the fringe fabricators, they couldn't guarantee it was going to be there on time because of COVID and everything that was going on. We needed, I think, 17, I can't remember, but it's an insane amount of fringe that we needed to secure, and we had to order it about, I think, 4 or 5 months ahead of time, because they had to make sure it could be produced so we would have enough. So there's all these elements that literally were finished within days of the exhibition opening. And so it's not the kind of fear for my life or anything like that, but it is, I've invested a huge amount of time in what I do, and thankful to Sarah and to Krista and to Jessica and Ross and Cody for figuring out all this stuff. There's a lot of people involved in this, and I would say as an artist, sometimes it's really hard to bring other people into that, because I have to take it seriously. I have to take it seriously that we're making 12-foot tall fringe cubes, and that's really my role, is to fight for that vision to be realized, and it does invoke a kind of fear, So I think, and maybe that's a little bit of a change, from things that have been made in the past. We definitely are at this place, and when I say we, I'm talking about the studio, where we're meeting deadlines just at exhibition point, and you're kind of hoping that your vision is going to function the way that you imagine that it will. And in this case, I could tell immediately that it did. When I walked in and I saw them completed, I was like, okay, it worked.
One of the things that, for me, I found the exhibit to be a real exercise in sort of attentiveness. And I'm thinking of my own sort of movement through it wasn't necessarily the movement of the gallery space, right? It was a movement, for me, was second floor, that sort of hallway with sort of some of the older work, geometrical, gridded kind of work, into the sort of first gallery where it's really clear there's all kinds of new thinking going on, into the fringe cubes, down to the videos and seeing the performance, right? And you could, for me, there was a kind of a flow that I imposed on the, on my own experience of the show, in which different kinds of, in which I was being challenged to different and deeper levels, right, at each one of those particular moments. And a lot of times, video, visual art in that particular sense can be among the most challenging things, right? Because it's not readily apparent, right? You actually have to do the work, to try to make sense of it. So So I suspect Sarah is about ready to take over, and we've got some questions. So I just wanted to sort of say a personal thank you, for the work.
Thank you, of course.
It's fabulous for me to have the opportunity to engage it and to be in conversation with you these last, X number of weeks. So,
Yeah, it's been great for me as well. Thank you.
Thank you both. That stop time for us, I think, out in the audience. So thank you. Some really great questions also, and I hope people can still share them if they have them. I'm going to start with one that's in-house, actually coming from Jessica May, who is our artistic director. Jessica writes, Jeff, when you were on site for installation, I remember looking at the cubes and remarking, and you sounded maybe a little surprised, the cubes were the closest you have ever been to minimalism. And she's wondering, I'm wondering whether some months later, what you were thinking about this relationship to minimalism, is it a useful reference to you now? And she says minimalism is so loaded. So
it is so loaded. I suppose many people have there are different relationships to minimalism. I think I understood, and this could be a long answer or a short answer, so I'm going to try to keep it short. But I suppose the thing is that, like, let's say that if I'm playing, this is my example, if I'm playing a sound for you, right, that sounds like a monotone sound, and you don't hear any variance in it, we can turn it up and we could potentially slow it down and you begin to hear variance in it. And so what seemed to be very simple and stable, when you get closer inspection, starts to kind of break apart into different pitches, different tones, and it's just the way that we hear it at different levels. Same thing with, like, something that might look minimal, like let's say if you just drew a straight line on a piece of paper, if you put it under a microscope, you suddenly begin to see that, like, it's actually not straight in the way that we think we're seeing it, but there's lots of hills and valleys and areas that it touched the surface of the paper and didn't touch the surface of the paper, and it's textured. So to me, minimalism is really about the perspective that you take on anything. And I think, I did in this case take a cube, right? And the cube being sort of like a form of minimalism that maybe we're all familiar with, part of the found object history of minimalism, but then did something to it that, has different levels. It's not just like the surface, but it's what happens when the surface moves within the environment. And, so I think, and that's kind of been, to me, the joy of digital, is that I can take something minimal and I can zoom in and I can look at it and I can break it apart and it suddenly becomes maximal, right? So they're always in conversation with each other, like the maximal and the minimal. And I think what was surprising about the cubes is that they both feel equally present. I finally understood and felt comfortable with them being described as maximalist, because they are, and also having a relationship to the history of minimalism. Even if superficially or loosely, but they're definitely the conception of the pieces are rooted in that kind of monolithic form.
Another question regarding to feel myself beloved on the earth. So the screenshot we saw earlier, the collaborators' movements and explorations in the film seem to derive not so much from an experience of Earth, but a specific place on Earth. Can you talk about the choreography of some of the dance and drumming sequences and how responsive collaborators were to place? Was place a collaborator, and as the video moves into different places? Could you talk about that?
I think, the video in particular, that video, because it was shot during quarantine, we could only shoot one person at a time for safety reasons. And we chose to bring people up to the Hudson Valley. Most of the video, the outdoor scenes, were shot either at my home in the Hudson Valley, or they were shot at Ardomai, the sculpture park. And we would find areas that were very open. We shot at 4 a.m. when there was no people around, so that was part of it. It also was partially about my connecting to the place where I physically live, right? And so during quarantine and being fed up and confused and tired and exhausted, like, being in nature was what was really giving me some mental space and some breathing space. So it is subjective in that way. As far as the choreography, when I collaborate with people, I always approach them by saying like, I'm not going to direct you. Like, you're here because of what you've already done, and that's you're bringing in who you are into what I have created as a platform or a stage or a narrative, and so I am not responsible for any of the choreography. I am responsible for, asking them, giving them sort of general direction about, I imagine you walking from this point to that point, and I imagine that you are paying attention to like the sound of the pine needles under your feet, right? And then I let them interpret that in the way that they want. And then I might ask them to like, let's do it, but a little bit slower. Let's do it, and I want you to kind of like discover something and stop and really look at it. And then so we shot, we had about 4 videographers altogether, and we had drone footage. We had an incredible drone videographer, and some still and handheld. So we had a lot to choose from. And then the stuff that we shot at Westbeth in New York City. We had all these amazing musicians who normally would be on tour, but because of COVID, we're not touring. So we had this wonderful group of people come, and again, I didn't tell them what to play. We provided the drums, we let them assemble them the way that they wanted to, and we had them each improvise about 5 to 6 different pieces that they would totally improvise, and then everything comes together in editing.
That's incredible to hear, and so interesting to hear like a positive outcome of COVID was you actually could make help hire people to have really talented people and bring them together. So that's actually, I hadn't thought about that.
Amazing.
Watching that. A question regarding your choices of color. So, one of the things found was interesting in your work is how you utilize bright, saturated neons, all the way to over very grayed out pastels. Are they colors you love, drawn from traditional or contemporary Indigenous cultures or works? Can you just elaborate on that?
I think, again, I'm going to say, like, from the time I was in college, my use of color has been criticized formally by my professors and things, and saying, like, it's too much color. If you're talking about Indigenous histories, I don't connect fluorescent with Native people. And I would say, well, have you ever been to a powwow? Because I have seen, the evolution of powwow regalia, in particular fancy dance and fancy shawl, and jingle dresses, they have incorporated, it's almost like the kind of spotlight quality of what happens in the arena when someone is dancing. Like, how do you draw attention to yourself? Well, it's your fluorescent ribbons like spinning and creating trails, and even like I've seen like roaches and like quills dyed, hot pink and magenta and fluorescent blue and yellow. So that's what my response would always be. I mean, my color palette is really informed by the kind of expansiveness of colors and materials that I've seen in powwow regalia. And then the earth tones and the pastels and things, I think, are probably coming more from me, just in color experimentations and trying to think about different ways of contrast beyond light and dark. But I think about, things that indicate natural versus man-made, or I think about things that represent speed versus slow, that kind of stuff. And then again, how it plays with figure-ground relationships.
I always love how you put together unexpected colors, asymmetrical or non completely unexpected.
It's so much fun. It's so much fun. And with the fringe cubes, it's interesting because I think we had somewhere around 22 colors we could choose from, so it's also the same thing with the beads. The beads, we generally have about 19 colors we can choose from, and I'm still not tired of them. You still find different combinations. With paint, of course, we can like mix pretty much any color we want and add to it. Right. And I think I really love the subtlety that can happen with color too. So it's rare, but I'll do like a white on white piece, which is these minute shifts of white. And it's interesting because when you put something next to white and you still want it to read as white, you have to put in the most minuscule amount of color and you'll still see the shift, right? If you go too far, it becomes a color. It no longer reads like a white. So those kind of things I still really love doing.
I have one last question, and this will maybe I think it's such a great telling question too about the range of work in the show. How do you approach artwork that you know will be composed by you individually versus works where you are the nexus that requires coordinated, aligned group effort? So this movement between artists, solo artists in the studio to community collaboration, or maybe you don't see it. Yeah, let you parse that out.
I think at this point, I just, you know, the collaborative works started off probably in, I'm going to say maybe 2015-ish. No, earlier than that, actually. 2011 were some sculptural pieces that really have to do with not wanting to like copy, right? Like I don't want to like sort of I don't want to go to museums and be like, oh, I like that beadwork, I'm going to go and learn how to make that beadwork and then make it, because I'm not there's something that feels disingenuous about that, right? So I think the idea of kind of paying attention to the world and thinking it's like, oh, Emily Johnson is doing these incredible things, I should just invite her and ask her to bring that into the mix. Or Eric Paul Reed makes these incredible images with his body. And, you know, so it really kind of was that easy, but I just didn't expect it to sort of grow so quickly in terms of the collaborations. And they're a lot of work, you know, they're a lot of work, which programming is, as you know, because you're a museum, programming is a lot of work. And generating content and keeping it kind of like fresh. And so so I think, yeah, that and then, but my love is really making a painting. That's really my love. So it's a struggle, but to juggle but
That's right. I like how they feed back into themselves.
Yeah.
They kind of circulate.
Well, that's the payoff. I think that, you know, I feel like if you're going to work really hard at something, there has to be some point at which you're like, oh, okay, this was worth it. And the kind of relationship between all of them is very much worth it for me.
Yeah. We've hit our time, and I want to thank everyone who's joined and shared questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everything. Philip or Jeff, if there's anything else you wanted to say or share before we all sign off.
I just want to say thank you. It's been really great, and I really appreciate that you brought us all together.
Yeah, I'm so glad it worked out. We did not, you hadn't known each other actually before this invitation came together, so it was really fabulous to know that you now have each other as friends and colleagues. All right, well, thank you all so much. Have a wonderful evening, and please stay tuned for upcoming programs and next steps, and come to Jeffrey's show, which is on view until March 13th. Thank you all. Good evening.
Great. Thank you.
Bye.